Malcolm X. Depending on who you ask, he may have been a racist or a revolutionary, an extremist, a freedom fighter, a prophet, or one of the most dangerous men America has ever produced. But dangerous to who exactly? Because history has a funny habit of turning people into villains long before it ever bothers listening to what they actually said. Tonight, I'm not going to tell you what to think about Malcolm X. I'm here to hand you the pieces the history books leave on the cutting room floor and let you build a picture for yourself. Grab a coffee. Grab a drink of choice. Dim the lights. This is After Dark Radio, and I am your host, Weezy. Before there was Malcolm X, there was a kid named Malcolm Little, born in Omaha, Nebraska in 1925. And if you want to understand why this man became who he became, you have to start with how much America had already taken from him before he was old enough to even vote. His father, Earl Little, was a Baptist preacher and a follower of Marcus Garvey's Black nationalist movement. That alone made him a target in an era when Black self-determination was treated as a threat. Earl died under circumstances the family always believed were a lynching, though authorities ruled it an accident. Funny how often that word shows up in a lot of these stories, right? Then his mother, Louise, was institutionalized and the little children were scattered into foster care. By his teens, Malcolm was in the streets of Boston and Harlem, running numbers, hustling, and eventually landing in prison on burglary charges. Here's where it gets kind of wild. Prison didn't break him. Prison built him. He read everything he could get his hands on. History, philosophy, religion. Sometimes copying entire pages of the dictionary by hand just to expand his rhetoric. Books became his weapon, and a man with a weapon like that doesn't stay quiet for too long. While inside, Malcolm was introduced to the teachings of Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. And for a lot of Black Americans living under Jim Crow, this message hit different. It wasn't asking for a seat at the table that never wanted them there. It was saying, build your own damn table. Malcolm became the nation's most electric voice. Sharp, fast, unshakable in debate. He didn't do the thing Black leaders were supposed to do, which was to beg. Instead, he challenged. And that scared people who had gotten very comfortable with the idea that progress should be polite. Ask yourself, why does a message of self-respect and self-reliance get labeled dangerous, while the conditions that made that message necessary rarely get labeled anything at all? Here's where the myth making really kicks in. Malcolm is remembered by a lot of people as a guy who wanted violence. But go back and actually read what he said. And the position was more precise than that. He was talking about self-defense, not aggression. By any means necessary. Wasn't a call to start a war. It was a refusal to promise nonviolence to people who were already being firebombed, beaten, and killed. Was that framing exaggerated by the press at the time? A lot of historians think so. A man who says, "I have the right to defend myself," gets flattened into, he wants a race war. And that flattened version is the one that ends up on the evening news and eventually into the history books. So why does this simplified, scarier version always seem to travel faster than the accurate one? Now, I'm not going to dodge this one because avoiding the quote-unquote difficult parts is simply not in my nature. At different points in his life, Malcolm made some remarks, particularly about Zionism and the state of Israel. And that drew serious criticism, including accusations of anti-Semitism. And if you really think about it, it's not very much different than today's climate. That criticism is real, and it's part of the historical record. Reporters have argued his comments were aimed at politics and colonialism, not at Jewish people as a whole, and that his broader views were still evolving right up until his death. But, of course, critics, the haters, will disagree. And that disagreement hasn't fully settled. Surprisingly, or I should say unsurprisingly enough, even many decades later. Suppose everyone can make their own judgment or opinion on this issue. I don't want to get too far into it, but I will say this. Labels have a way of doing our thinking for us. And once a label sticks, people stop reading the paragraph and simply react to the word. And that's worth thinking about, no matter what side of this particular argument you're on. By the early 60s, the FBI had a phrase they used internally for what they feared most: the rise of the Black Messiah. a charismatic leader capable of unifying Black Americans around a single, cohesive movement. Malcolm fit that profile exquisitely. So did others. And that fear didn't stay theoretical. This is documented. It's not conspiracy. You can look it up yourself. The FBI's counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, targeted Black nationalist organizations and civil rights leaders throughout the 1950s and 60s. Wiretaps, informants planted inside organizations, anonymous letters designed to sow distrust between allies. PSYOPs, in other words. These psychological operations were meant to fracture movements from the inside instead of confronting them from the outside. Malcolm X operated inside this environment, under surveillance by both the FBI and the NYPD in the years before his death. That surveillance is a matter of the historical record. So here's a question to think about. When a government has the tools, the motive, and a documented history of infiltrating movements like this one, how much of what unraveled around Malcolm in his final years happened on its own? Malcolm's loyalty to Elijah Muhammad had been close to damn near absolute. But in the early 60s, he learned of personal misconduct by Elijah Muhammad that contradicted everything the movement had claimed to stand for. I won't go into the details, but let's just say Mr. Elijah Muhammad was engaging into Jeff Epstein types of behavior. And Malcolm's disappointment was public, and so was his criticism. And in an organization built around with a leader with supreme control, that kind of public break doesn't just cost you a friendship, it makes you enemies. And those enemies didn't stay quiet either. In 1964, Malcolm made the pilgrimage to Mecca, and what he saw there cracked his worldview wide open. Muslims of every race and background, praying shoulder to shoulder, with no hierarchy of color at all. For a man who had spent years building a framework around race as the defining line of American life, this was crazy huge. Came back changed, speaking much less about race in isolation and more about the human rights and international solidarity and a broader struggle that stretched beyond America's borders. And did the country notice this evolution? Or did it keep judging him by the version of himself he had already outgrown? That question matters more than it sounds like it does, because we do this to public figures constantly. And maybe not even public figures, but people we know somewhat well. We freeze them at their most controversial moment. and we refuse to let the tape keep rolling. On February 21st, 1965, in the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem, Malcolm X is shot and killed while preparing to speak. 3 men were convicted: Talmadge Hayer, Norman 3X Butler, and Thomas 15X Johnson. Hayer admitted his role, but insisted the other 2 men were innocent, a claim he repeated for decades. And here's a part that took over half a century to surface. In 2021, Butler and Johnson, by then known as Muhammad Aziz and the late Khalil Islam, were formally exonerated after prosecutors acknowledged that evidence favorable to their defense, including FBI documents, had been withheld at trial. Half a century. Wrongfully convicted men, some of whom died before their names were ever cleared. And Malcolm X himself had been under documented FBI, NYPD surveillance in the lead up to his assassination. Historians and researchers have spent decades debating whether authorities had advanced knowledge, whether informants were closer to the plot than officially acknowledged, and whether intervention was possible but never attempted. What we can say with certainty is the surveillance happened. The wrongful convictions happened. What we can't say with certainty is exactly how those 2 facts connect to what happened inside that ballroom. That question remains open and perhaps supposed to stay open as a reminder of how much can slip through the cracks of an investigation nobody was in a hurry to finish. Most people know Malcolm X from a handful of quotes ripped out of context and stapled to a single chapter of his life. But few people ever get introduced to the man who came back from Mecca, and fewer still get taught that full arc. The kid who lost his father, the hustler, the prisoner, the firebrand, the man who broke from his mentor, the pilgrim, the internationalist. History loves freezing complicated people at their most convenient moment. It's easier to teach a villain or a saint than a man who kept changing his mind in public, out loud, and under fire. Malcolm X said once, "I am for truth, no matter who tells it." Maybe that's what made him dangerous. Not because he had all the answers, but because he kept asking questions. And history has shown us governments often tolerate people who speak. They become far less comfortable with people who make others think. Whether you see Malcolm X as a hero or a villain or something in between, one thing is certain: his story is far more complicated than the version most of us were taught. And around here, complicated stories are usually the ones worth digging into. And as usual, I want y'all to stay curious and please question absolutely everything.